Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the New Yankee Workshop. Nearly 200 years ago, a family of clockmakers from Easton, Long Island built a tall case clock. Eventually, it found its way to the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. Not only is the clock there, but the shops where it was built. We'll go there next, and then we'll come back here and build our own version of the Dominy Clock. That's next, right here in the New Yankee Workshop.
The year is 1760, and we're in the workshop of the Dominy family. You recognize any of the tools here, Norm?
Oh, I sure do recognize a lot of these tools. I don't have all of these, but boy, they're wonderful to look at. Look at this plane. It must be 2.5 feet long.
It's an incredible tool. It is a joiner plane. It was made by Nathaniel Dominy in 1766.
So they made a lot of their own tools.
Yes, they did.
And I see some familiar things, a dovetailing saw, a little molding plane, plenty of other planes. And across the shop, there's another workbench set up with a project in the works. Looks like the base of a table. We have a turned column. And they're cutting the dovetails in for these legs. And what's this, some kind of top?
This is the top to that table. It's a reproduction of the very table that Dominy's built in about 1800. The top is being turned on this great wheel lathe.
Now, you just didn't create this scene. I mean, you lifted all these tools and workbenches out of an actual woodworking shop.
The tools and the benches all come from the shop that the Dominys operated between about 1740 and 1825.
Well, it's great that the collection seems to be totally complete. You're really lucky.
We're very fortunate, and it's terrific to have this opportunity to be able to share this with the public.
Now, they specialized in clocks.
They did. Let's go look at one. One of the surviving clocks is over here, made in 1824 by Felix Dominy in that shop with those tools on those benches.
Interesting piece. I don't think I've ever seen one quite like this. It's very diminutive. It's narrow and it's shallow. I've never seen a clock this shallow. And the details are fairly simple.
They are. It does have a wonderful crest on top, as well as an arch over the door.
Appears to be made out of pine, possibly.
That's correct, white pine.
And it looks like a stain because you can still see the grain. Can I see behind the door?
Let's take a look.
Oh, so there's another frame that mimics the shape of the door.
That's right.
What about the clock face?
The face is wood. It's actually cherry. It's been painted then with the numbers in the background paint.
Really? Now, I only see one wind-up mechanism there.
That's because this is a timepiece, not a chimed clock.
I see. So it has no chimes on the hour.
That's right.
But it does have a pendulum.
It does. It's down in the waist of the clock.
Well, I can see that they had plenty of tools over in the shop to build the case, but where did they get the clock works?
They had their own clock shop where they cut the gears and made all the parts needed for the works.
Wow, this is a tiny little shop and filled with tools, none of which I recognize, except maybe this one right here, this tiny little mallet.
These are all metalworking tools that the Dominys used to make the parts for their clocks.
And what was this device used for?
It's an amazing piece of equipment. This was used to cut the gears for each precise part of each clock.
Wow. It's amazing that back in those days, using this type of equipment, they could build a clock that was very accurate.
It really is incredible.
Well, you know what I'd like to do, Greg? I'd like to take some measurements and a few photographs of that clock, and then we'd be able to build our own version back at the New Yankee Workshop.
Be pleased to help you with that.
All right. Well, here it is, our version of the Dominy clock from Winterthur. And it's a pretty faithful reproduction. One thing I noticed when I was at Winterthur is that they had secured the clock to the wall, and that's a good idea because it's a bit top-heavy and I don't want it to fall over. So when I bring it home, I'm going to put a little bracket against the wall. Now let's look at some of the details. I've built ours out of poplar because we're going to paint it. And starting down here at the bottom, you see a low base with a little decorative edge. The front is a single board with a cutout for the door. And don't bother looking for a pendulum inside because there is none. We're using a quartz movement. If you go up a little bit higher, you can see this molding that wraps below the bonnet, a hinged door behind which sits another frame panel, and then there's the clock face and the dial board. Up at the very top, a decorative crest. The first piece I want to work on is the front of the waist, and that's what this piece is for. I want to make a shallow rabbet in each edge to receive the sides. So I've set up my stacked dado with a featherboard to hold the stock tight to the table. Now before I run it through, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now let's take a look at the prototype. I'm going to spin around and show you the back. The next thing I want to do is make a rabbet in the sides of the waist, the sides of the bonnet, and the top of the bonnet to receive the back panel. Here's the back for the clock. It's a piece of 1/2-inch plywood. I need to notch each edge all the way up to this point and then cross-cut it where it meets the bonnet. This series of holes will be for the screws, which will secure the back to the sides. Now here I've relieved the bottom edge of the back to eliminate any possibility of the clock being unstable on an uneven floor. Now here I have the two side pieces for the waist clamped together, and I'm making a small notch at the top so that the bonnet can overlay the waist. Now this is the first step of the assembly. I've installed the bottom on the case. It's installed with glue and brads, and here's the front, and you can see that this is held back so that it'll receive that rabbet. And here's the other side. The antique clock had a hinged door, so they would have access to the pendulum. Since we don't have a pendulum, we don't have that need. In fact, I could have fixed this door closed. However, I want access to the inside of the clock, so I can shellac it from bottom to top. So I'm going to make the back removable as well. Screws only. I just want to make sure that it's flush with the bottom before I start driving the screws home. Okay, now I'm getting ready to install the front. Nice bead of glue in that rabbet. No mechanical fasteners here because I don't want to have to deal with filling nail holes. So I'll just clamp it in place. Well, what do you think? Enough clamps? Maybe one more. This assembly is the case for the bonnet, and it's assembled with glue, brads, and a few screws. While this sets up, we'll work on the door of the bonnet and the panel that goes behind it. Here on the full-scale drawing, you see the outline of the dial face. I've clamped this piece of wood, which is going to be the top rail of the door, in the correct position. My pivot point for the arch on the door is right there, so I've transferred that onto another piece of wood. I line it up with my center point, and I've already set the compass to the right radius, and all I have to do now is lay it out. Now here I'm resetting the compass for the arch at the top of that rail. And there's the top of the arch. At the same time I cut this inner arch on the door, I'm going to cut the arch on this panel that sits in front of the dial board. Here's the top rail for the door that I've laid out. Here's some double stick tape. One side is already stuck to that piece. Now I can peel off the release paper for the other side of the double stick. Take the blank for the inner panel, line it up, and stick them together. Now I have a sandwich. Before I separate these two pieces, I want to route the bead along the arc. And that's the other side. Now I can take it apart. The bead on all the straight pieces can be done here at the router table using the same bit. The parts of the door are joined together with mortise and tenon joinery. Here's the tenon, there's the mortise. I like to cut the mortises first. This is the first of a series of cuts that I need to make to form the tenons. Now if you look at the joint, you can see that it comes along square on the flat part and it's mitered at the bead. I want to make the miter on the mortise piece first, so I've set up a stop block, tip my blade to 45 degrees, and I'll guide it through with my fence. Now with a different setup, using a stop on my miter gauge, I can miter the bead on the tenon pieces. Now I want to remove the bead up to this miter cut. I'll get the majority of it with the saw, and I'll clean the rest of it up with a chisel. Okay, that's good. Before I assemble the door, I want to complete the top rail by making a straight cut in from each end and then completing the arch. Now comes the assembly of the door with glue only. All right, we'll set it aside in the clamps to dry for a while. Let's take another look at our prototype. The frame that sits in front of the dial face is made out of 5/16 thick material, and it's mitered using the same techniques I used on the door. Now these pieces are joined together with glue and a few pins. No mortises, no tenons. Let's take another look at the crest. If you look at this piece right here above the door, it actually goes behind this cove and forms the crest. If I swing the clock to the side, you can see that that piece starts out 1 1/16 wide here. When it gets above the case, I've feathered it back, and up a little higher, just below the lowest cut of the scroll, I've thinned it to 1/2 inch. And that's the way it was done on the original. And I think they did it that way to give the piece some lightness. And I'm going to do it the same way. Here's the blank of 5/4 for that piece. The first thing I want to do is remove the material behind the upper portion of the crest. So I've set the blade to the correct height. I'll make a rip pass this way, reset the fence, lower the blade, and cut the rest of it out. Now here's a pattern of the crest that I made from a photograph I took while I was at Winter Tour, and I'll just trace that onto this rail. Well, we got a good start on our clock today. Before I leave tonight, I'll finish cutting out this crest, and tomorrow we should easily finish the clock. Well, good morning. Last night I continued working on that crest, and I pulled off the bonnet so I can show you the details of the crest. Now on the antique original, not only did they remove material at the top edge to make it look light, but they also feathered it back. So what I'm going to do today with this one is take a router and start to remove some of that material. I'm using a 1/2 inch cove bit here, and I'm only going from this point to this point. And we'll finish making that taper with some hand tools. Okay, now that that's complete, I can cut out the arch on the front. Well, now I'm ready to attach this crest. A little bit of glue. I'll line it up on my marks, clamp it, and then nail it from the back side. Now I want to remove the excess of this piece that comes through the case, because I don't want to see that from the side. Here I've simply eased that bottom edge with a 1/4 inch radius bit. Let's look at the prototype again. There's a molding, a deep cove that runs along the side, comes around the front, and arches up over the case. Now I'm going to make that molding from this piece of material. It's 5/8 of an inch thick. I've laid out the molding. I'm going to cut the inside arch first, sand it, and then take it to the router table to make the cove. Here's the router setup. I've installed a 3/4 inch cove bit and a start pin because I'm not using my fence. I'll take 2 passes to complete it. With the routing complete, I can cut out the other edge of the molding. And I'll clean up the corners with some hand tools. Here I've taken a piece of 5/8 inch thick straight stock, run it through the router to create the cove, and now I've ripped it for the straight pieces. Now I have to miter the corners. So I've carefully marked the arched piece, and we'll cut a miter on each end. A little bit of glue and some pin nails to fasten the moldings. Now a couple more steps on the inside of this bonnet. I put these little glue blocks across these joints. Since there's no mortise and tenon there, I want to add a little more reinforcement behind it. And I'm also going to add this strip flush to the bottom, and that'll help lock the bonnet to the waist when it's assembled. Okay, that takes care of the door opening, and while I have the jigsaw out, I want to make this little arched cut at the base of the waist. Here's the blank for the door. The first thing I want to do is make a bead around the edge. Now I've switched over to a rabbiting bit. Because this is an overlay door, I need a rabbet on all 4 edges. Now I want to start working on this base detail that wraps the bottom of the waist. I made a cutout in the case for the front, but on the sides I'm going to let it run through just like they did on the antique. If I were to cut out this arch in the side of the case, I would end up with very fragile legs. But before I wrap it with the base, I want to paint it black so it'll disappear. I'm using a wavy edge bit to form a profile along the top edge of the base. Now I like to reinforce these mitered joints on the base with a number 20 biscuit. Now the whole assembly slides over the sub base, and I'll attach it with some screws from the inside. Now I want to mill up this molding. It'll take 3 passes and 3 bits. I'm going to get 2 pieces of molding out of this 1.5 inch thick blank. I've just made the first pass with a 1/2 inch half round bit. I've reinstalled a 3/4 inch radius cove bit, and I've removed the guide bearing because I'm using my fence and I don't want the bearing to hit the bead that I just made. It's going to take 2 passes to get to where I want. Now I've installed a 1/4 inch radius bit and also removed the bearing for clearance. I'm going to run the pieces on edge for the final pass. We wrap this just like we did with the other moldings with some glue and nails. Now this 3/4 inch piece of plywood is for the dial board. I've just drilled a hole for the clock works. It'll come through here for our hands. I'm going to drill another hole here partway through. It would be for a wind-up movement, but in this case it's going to be purely decorative. You'll notice that I spray painted the fake hole black, and I've attached the dial board to this cleat, which in turn attaches to the tops of the sides. Now, this little post is just a spacer to keep the dial board where I want it. Now for the dial board, which gets centered over that hole. Here's the quartz movement, a little brass washer, and a nut. We'll secure that down. Now the minute hand slides on, and a little brass nut to hold it in place. Now before I can hang the door, I have to make a rabbet on the inside to receive the glass panel. So I made this simple jig out of plywood with some cleats that just drops over the assembled door, and you can see it's cut back about 5/8 of an inch around the edges. I'm going to use a router with a 3/4 inch collar and a 1/2 inch bit to remove the material. Well, here's the door all rabbeted out. Now when I built the prototype, I noted that before I could put the hinges on, I had to relieve the door right in this area. If I start to swing it up, it binds. So I've drawn a line on the back, and using some hand tools, I'll bevel that area of the door. Now these holes are for some homemade hinges, very much like the antique hat. It's just an eye screw that I've modified slightly, made the loop a little bit tighter. And I'm going to screw these into the case first. Now in the door, I've installed 2 eye screws, but they're open. I can take those, slip them into the closed ones, close the door, and then I can cinch these closed. All right, that works great. The lower door gets installed with the same type of hinges, and then this will be ready for some paint. For the finish on our clock, we're going to use a paint, much like the antique original. And over here I have a sample of the color we're using. It's the one on the bottom. It's called Garrison Red, and it's a latex paint. However, I'm starting with a primer, and it's close to the finished color. After the primer goes on, we'll probably put 2 coats of the finish, which will have a satin sheen to it. Well, here it is, our version of the tall case clock, completely painted with a glass panel installed in the upper door. And every time I look at this clock, I'm going to think of the Dominy Clock works at the Winterthur Museum. And now this clock will be part of that history.